My name is Heather Wokusch, and thank you very much for joining us. Today we're going to talk about the potential for election fraud in the United States. Now, from hackable voting machines to the possible disenfranchisement of eligible voters, the U.S. really is facing some challenges in this area. And here to discuss this with us is Mark Crispin Miller, who is a professor of media, culture, and communication at New York University. Now, Mark Crispin Miller is the author of several books, including Fooled Again, The Real Case for Electoral Reform. He was the author also of Loser Take All, Election Fraud, and the Subversion of Democracy, which is a fabulous title. In addition, he was the author of a seminal piece in 2005 in Harper's called None Dare Call It Stolen, Ohio, the Election, and America's Servile Press. So without further ado, thank you so much for having joined us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So let's start with that None Dare Call It Stolen, in that you draw the connection between the irregularities in the 2004 election and the press's complicity in at least certainly not reporting it well enough. There's a lot of topics in that area. What kind of themes do you see as still valid and relevant now?
The problem of election fraud is, even more pressing than it was back then, 7 years ago, and the danger is even greater because our voting system is almost completely compromised in that it's been largely computerized and privatized, which is no way to run a democracy. But the fact is, just to bring this home to us, talking in the run-up to the next election, that as troubled as the Romney-Ryan campaign is at the moment, if it can be made to seem at all close, and close doesn't even necessarily mean that close, it is quite possible that they could steal it, because it wouldn't be the first time that has happened since 2000. Including 2000 itself. Now, let me make a kind of qualifying statement. There has been election fraud and voter fraud in this country forever. It's not anything new, and both parties have always engaged in it. People know the story of Lyndon Johnson's rise to power in the Senate. It was based on at least one stolen race. Huey Long, the notorious governor of Louisiana, was another sort of populist Democrat who used foul means to advance his agenda. Foul means electorally speaking. So it's been a kind of bipartisan scandal for a very long time. But what we're witnessing now, what we've been seeing since the year 2000, is entirely different. It's much, much different. What we've seen now is electoral victories by the right in cycle after cycle, in race after race, that are arguably the result of election fraud and vote suppression combined. And we're looking at another race in which that is possible, even though in a perfect world, Obama would be sailing to victory because he's the more popular of the two candidates, clearly, according to every poll. But that's not going to be the way it works. Let's just say there's a very good chance that it won't be the way it works because this has happened before.
And that's the interesting point, because it has happened before. The data is there. It really is not questionable. Yet often, if you even mention, the topic of election fraud, then you're called a conspiracy theorist. So can you tell us, after you wrote your book, Fooled Again, now I understand the press wasn't exactly knocking on your door to learn more about your findings. Can you tell us about your experience?
Well, yeah. I wrote Fooled Again because it was quite obvious that the race, the 2004 presidential election, had been stolen. There are many ways to make that argument. And in fact, a lot of stuff has come to light since I wrote the book that make it even more obvious that it was stolen. I can talk about that because it's quite harrowing and people will be interested in hearing it. So I set to work, did a very thorough, meticulous job researching this, and thought to myself, well, this is going to change everything. This is going to really make a difference, I thought, naively. The book came out to a resounding silence. The publicist at Basic Books had never seen anything like it. And a publicist I hired to help out, an experienced publicist who represented a lot of very, big names, likewise had never seen anything like the big iron door that was locked. It was impossible to get reviews. It was impossible to get interviews on NPR. Because here's a story. I have a friend who lives in Philadelphia, has a small foundation, and he offered to put up the money to pay for some ads for the book on WHYY, which is the NPR affiliate in Philadelphia.
Okay.
He called them. He asked them, do you run ads for books? They said, sure, no problem. Here's how much it costs, etc. Send us the spots and we'll run them. So we wrote the spots together. And then he sent them in and contacted them. And they said, no, we're not running these. He said, well, why not? And they said, well, we don't run political advertising. He said, well, Mark Crispin Miller's not running for office. He wrote a book about the voting system. And they said, well, we wouldn't advertise just any book. I mean, we wouldn't advertise Mein Kampf.
Oh, God.
They really said that.
Oh,
See?
God. Yeah.
The point is that the subject is taboo. And if I had a nickel for every time somebody said, well, that's a conspiracy theory, I mean, I wouldn't have to be working for a living anymore. I'd be well off.
So the question then is, how can we have a functioning democracy if we can't even question the validity of our voting system?
Well, you've made two important points at once. First of all, we can't have a functioning democracy if we have a voting system that's computerized and privatized.
Exactly.
Right? In which something like 98% of the precincts in this country, the voting process is dominated by one of 3 or 4 private companies whose owners are extremely right-wing activists. This is a fact. That's sobering. You can't have a democracy with a system like that.
And the results are not traceable. Well, that's the other thing, too.
Of course, the results are not traceable. There is no way to observe the vote count. It's impossible to observe a vote count when you have computerized optical scanners counting the votes, machines that are only as honest as the last person who programmed them. This is why computerized voting systems are illegal. They've been outlawed. In Germany, for example, the High Court ruled that you cannot have a voting system, right, in which there's no human agency involved in the counting of the vote and people can't watch it be counted. That's Germany. Ireland literally sent its electronic machinery to the scrap heap. They threw them out. They said, this is a terrible idea. It was a disastrous experiment. We're stopping it. The same thing happened in the Netherlands. I mean, they understand something there that we can't even discuss, okay? So not only can we not have a functioning democracy with a voting system like this, but as you say, we also can't have a functioning democracy when we can't discuss such issues because they're dismissed as conspiracy theory.
What were your feelings when you spent so much time putting together this information with this book and then you met this deafening silence?
How did it feel?
Yeah.
It's kind of a sports question.
You have an 11-year-old child. What were your ideas? What was going through your head when you realized?
It was extremely frustrating and enraging to be working on something of such tremendous importance and working in earnest, This isn't an experience that I alone have had. I mean, there are a number of people who engage in the same research and are just as fired up by the mission of trying to get the voting system reformed so that it's trustworthy, it's reliable. I mean, and just to put people's minds at rest on one point, I'm not a Democrat. I don't have much use for the Democratic Party or, frankly, President Obama. I believe that whoever gets elected by the people should serve. I respect that. So Obama was elected in 2008, and he was elected, by the way, by a far larger number of voters than we think, because there was a tremendous amount of fraud that went on then. However, for a number of reasons, he did prevail. One of them was the collapse of Lehman Brothers shortly before the election. This really hurt the Republicans. Similarly, in 2006, when a lot of Democrats picked up seats in Congress, there had been the Mark Foley Page scandal just before, where this homophobic Republican congressman, it turned out, had been having sex with all these male pages. And that really did the Republican Party so much harm that it kind of threw off their calculations. There's still a tremendous amount of fraud that went on. So I'm not this is not a partisan exercise, and the people in this election integrity movement, which is a very small movement, a small, poor movement, are not partisans. They're simply committed to the ideal of an electoral democracy.
Yeah, and that also raises other questions. I mean, we've discussed the voting machines and how, the potential for corruption, but also I read that a presidential candidate needs an absolute minimum of $500 million in order to be even viable. And so the amount of money that is necessary just to run for political office is really, in the United States, very different from other countries. For me, for example, I've lived in Japan, I've lived in Austria, I've lived in many different countries, and it's pretty much standard. For one, they don't have voting machines, and there's also no problem getting the results back on time. They physically count them. You've got people from all parties watching. It's very transparent, and you get the results back on time. But this whole thing of campaign finance, you don't need $500 million to run. You need connections,
right.
But that means that the people who are actually serving in, the parliament or whatever, government group they have, they aren't necessarily rich people, and so in that sense they can be more connected to, the normal people. So we're dealing with a number of issues here. One is this system creates kind of elitist people, who can run because they need that much cash.
Right.
And then you've got those people who control the voting machines. And so it really begs the question of what is that distinction doing to our democracy as well, this gap?
There are really three kinds of reform that are interconnected and necessary. And they are campaign finance reform, election reform, and media reform. Without those three reforms ongoing simultaneously, we're screwed, basically. Certainly, Citizens United is a disaster. It enables basically any interest to pump as much money as they want into the race, and the money will always go to people who don't have the interests of the common good at heart, right?
Okay.
So that's all true. Now, let me make a distinction. Campaign finance reform, Citizens United, that's a subject that people will discuss. They will also discuss the spate of Jim Crow laws that's been passed throughout the country over the last several months, last few years actually, requiring voter ID and otherwise giving us a kind of modern version of the old poll tax and the literacy test, which were used to keep black people from voting.
Shutting down early voting hours and stuff like this.
Well, there are all kinds of laws, ways to limit student voting, minority voting, the voting by the poor, and so on. This has been going on. That is another subject that has been discussed. It is deemed permissible to talk about that kind of legislation. That's all good. We should be talking about Citizens United. We should be talking about these Jim Crow laws.
And we should be talking about voting machines.
Well, I was about to say, the one subject that people will not discuss that is deemed conspiracy theory is election fraud through electronic means. And this does go on repeatedly. For example, in 1996, Senator Chuck Hagel of Nebraska, an unknown millionaire, won election to the Senate against all odds. He defeated incumbent Senator Ben Nelson, a conservative Democrat. It was not widely known, I don't think anybody knew at the time, that his last job before he became a candidate was as the CEO of ES&S, which is a huge voting machine company, right, whose machines counted the votes in his race for the Senate. And he won by startlingly high margins. And the same thing happened 6 years later. I mean, he took 83% of the vote, even in black precincts, right? It makes no sense. There were 400,000 registered Democrats in Nebraska. His Democratic opponent got something like 60,000 votes or 70,000. I mean, clearly this is at the very least suspicious. If it happened in Iran or Venezuela or Russia, our press would have no problem saying, wait a minute, this is suspicious. But here, no, you can't talk about it. It's conspiracy theory to do so. Well, I mean, I could tell similar stories about races since then in state after state after state, right? Scott Walker, he and his opponent Tom Barrett in the recent recall election started out the day neck and neck, according to the very few unadjusted exit polls that were published, neck and neck. By the end of the evening, he was 7 points ahead. That's not even humanly possible, okay? It's obviously very suspicious. Now, we're talking about candidates, people with ties to the Koch brothers and so on, who are radically hostile to democracy itself. They will clearly do anything to attain power, right? And people will generally agree, well, yeah, they do all kinds of horrible things to be elected. But if you say to them, well, they also obviously will resort and have clearly resorted to election fraud through electronic means, people say, no, that's a conspiracy theory. I mean, clearly, at the very least, we have to grant that we don't know whether or not the results of most of our elections are legitimate or not. We literally have no way of knowing. So I think it's in the interests of people left and right alike, Democrats and Republicans and so on, and people in third parties, to maybe at least have the conversation about the need for us to return to some kind of more verifiable voting system. Not to say, again, that we haven't had elections stolen in the past. We always have.
Just in a different way.
Well, with electronic systems in place run by private companies with a partisan agenda, the scale of election fraud and the ease, right, and the imperceptibility are vastly different. So you can steal races on a far larger scale than you ever could in the old days when it was just like Mayor Daley's shenanigans in Chicago. I'm from Chicago, so I remember that kind of thing myself. What we have today is radically different, and the stakes are very, very high. Let me say one thing about third parties.
Okay.
I'm a strong believer in third parties, but as I tell my friends in third parties, including Ralph Nader, as long as the voting system is dominated by the radical right, as it basically is, the theocratic wing of the Republican Party, and radical libertarian interests, a third party run is a waste of time, because the third party effort will be used, as a way to mask the theft of the election, because you'll simply shunt votes that went to the Democrats, to the third party and say, well, they just did better than expected.
What did Nader say when you talked to him about this?
Well, Nader was receptive to this, and he understands this thing intellectually, and he has called for reform of the voting system. But at the same time, he is understandably so hostile to the Democratic Party that I don't know how far he wants to go towards recognizing that they have been robbed. By the way, Democrats routinely spit at the sound of Nader's name, claiming that he cost Al Gore the election in Florida. This is simply false, because for one thing, as most Americans still don't know, Al Gore did not lose the election in 2000. All the votes in Florida were ultimately counted by the media consortium that does these things under the auspices of the University of Chicago. The results were released 2 months after 9/11.
Quietly,
Very quietly, and they discovered that Al Gore won the election in 2000. So that it's not an argument. I mean, it couldn't have been taken away from him by Ralph Nader because he didn't lose. If he didn't fight for it, as he probably couldn't, given that it was 2 months after 9/11, right? That's not Ralph Nader's fault, you see. The fact, though, Heather, that this fact, that Gore won, is generally unknown by the American people, tells us something very unflattering about our media system, don't you think?
I would say so, but also I think the question is, and especially we've got this election coming up, how can people fight back? Because, okay, we need election reform, we need campaign finance reform, we need media reform of this. People are busy working, and they're busy, getting their political ads and trying to donate, $5 here or there. And so in a functioning democracy, how can we make this a functioning democracy and do that quickly? We've got the Koch brothers on the one side. We've got these horrible machines on the other. It can seem very overwhelming, I think.
Sure, but I mean, you can't just give up, because the alternative is to be destroyed, by really feral interests that want to turn the country into a hell on earth,
So one thing is actually to understand and to look at the dangers of the voting machines.
Well, of course, you can accomplish great changes by starting out with a kind of fervent commitment to that issue on the part of a considerable plurality. It wouldn't hurt if a lot of our stars of the left people like Michael Moore and Rachel Maddow and Noam Chomsky and others would face this issue, which they don't. They dismiss it. They won't talk about it for the most part.
Why
they
do
will
you think
talk
that
about
is?
Well, it's in Chomsky's case, it's because he is ideologically committed to the notion that the two parties are the same and that the problems with democracy are far more profound. I'm sympathetic to that argument, but he does deny the fact that election results have been determined fraudulently. And certain things like the war in Iraq wouldn't have happened.
Exactly.
That's insignificant. We'd also have been making greater strides towards solving the climate crisis if Al Gore had been allowed to serve, see?
If he had fought.
But if it hadn't been stolen, right?
Yeah, but if he had fought back, too. Al Franken fought.
Well, he did.
And he won. So for me personally, I was just,
Yeah, right. Michael's case and Rachel... precisely because this is like the third rail of political discourse. You cannot talk about election fraud, or you're immediately branded a conspiracy theorist. It could be professional suicide for them to go there. I don't mean to single them out. This is pervasive across the spectrum of the left. There are very, very few left pundits. I can't actually think of any, except maybe Tom Hartman, who will discuss this forthrightly and thoroughly as it deserves to be discussed. So people could press their favorite talk show hosts and media personalities to begin to address this kind of thing.
You could argue also that Tom Hartman is on Russia Today or something
Russian
like that,
television.
so he might have more ability to discuss these things than those who are on U.S. television.
Well, that's true. Plus, but let's not pin it all on the big stars. I mean, the fact is we do live in a thriving kind of blogosphere, and people should simply pay attention to those who are investigating these issues, like Brad Friedman. Bradblog.com is a great outlet. And the Election Defense Alliance. I can't recommend them strongly enough because they do election forensics. There are others like Bev Harris, and she's very good. There are people doing this work. The thing is that other people have to focus on the work that's being done and not simply succumb to the temptation to say that can't be true because you don't want it to be true.
Right.
But the fact is that the American people have for too long had a warped conception of who they are because of these distorted election results. If we ignore the exit polls, which say one thing, and believe only in the official results, which often say something radically different, we then draw the conclusion that the right in this country is far larger and more representative than it really is. And that goes for the rest of the world. They look at our country and they say, well, these people are ridiculous. Have they reelected Bush, right?
Yeah.
Well, the fact is we didn't reelect Bush, okay? He got reelected. You have to put scare quotes around it, But if you look into it, you see that he was repudiated at the polls. The rest of the world, however, draws the understandable conclusion that we're politically, primitive, or we're stupid, and we're taken in by this propaganda. Or we draw the somewhat more sophisticated, but no less undemocratic conclusion that all that right-wing money has actually worked and that people have been taken in by all that propaganda, which you can't really necessarily, believe. I mean, here's a good example. During Monica Gate, you could not get away from that story. Everywhere you looked, there was stuff that made Bill Clinton look terrible. The fact is that a considerable majority of the nation's citizens did not think he should be impeached. It was, well over 60%. So the fact is they were not influenced by all that propaganda. It didn't work. So why should we assume, that just because races go a certain way and the far right has spent tons of money on them, why should we assume that those results are legitimate and that the money did what it was intended to do? See?
I think there's just so many factors that you don't know which element of corruption is working. But I think the whole point that you had mentioned before in these three areas of possible reform is that we need to get rid of all of these factors. But it's hard to know where to start. I'd like to add one other thing regarding the media. The New York Times had an interesting article, I believe it was in July, saying that virtually every single media story that goes out regarding this campaign has to get government approval first. For example, if there's a quote from Obama or there's a quote from Romney or whatever, they have to first send it back to the campaign to be sure it's correct, and then they make it sound pretty, and then they're allowed to publish it. I mean, that's crazy. I mean, that's
well,
not...
Sure.
Yeah, and so that we don't know ourselves, but then obviously we don't know who the candidates are either in so many ways, and so how can we even vote for them if their quotes are redacted?
Listen, we could do a whole separate show on the New York Times as political coverage, because it's all it is theater, third-rate theater criticism. They basically talk about what the campaign did today, what the candidate is trying to, how he's trying to look, the pose he's trying to strike. And who can't see that for himself? I mean, it's like talking about the weather. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Romney's trying to look like he's honest. Oh, gee, stop the presses. Do you know what I mean?
Or what would it take for the New York Times to run a front-page article saying, oh, my God, look at the corruptibility of these voting machines?
That's a question I've asked myself over the years. They devote infinitely more space to video games than they do to the voting system. They won't go there. I mean, I've had many go. I can't. I have some ideas about this. Mm-hmm. The fact is that the subject is taboo. Mm-hmm. It is taboo. You cannot talk about it in the media.
But who defines taboo? Is that the government? Is that the media? It's not the people.
Well, that's true. It's not the people.
So that's the question. Is the government defining it? Because it's very odd to me. What would it take in order for people to actually get on the street and say, okay, that is enough? Because after, the last couple of elections, certainly when Bush got in, it was just so transparent that things had been stolen. And your book and the Harper's article just detailed it beautifully. But if you can't, get angry based on very specific facts, how are you going to get angry?
Well, the question, I think, is... or a related question is, how can you reform the system if there's not a scandal driving that? There's never been a reformist movement that has not been driven by outrage over some scandal. Mm-hmm. If you continue to hush it up for whatever reason, I think the Democrats have been just as involved in hushing it up as anybody else.
Clearly,
for their own reasons, If you're going to continue to hush it up, you will simply never solve the problem. It's like not cleaning a wound. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
So
there have been so many scandals. What kind of scandal would it take, do you think, for people actually to get up and say, okay, that's it, we have to get rid of this?
Well, it's possible that if it's stolen this time by Romney Ryan, that it will finally, force some people, considerable number of people out of their trance on this subject. Which
if
would be
Obama fought.
Maybe even if he doesn't, I mean, who knows what will happen? You never do know.
Mm-hmm. I can't thank you enough for having come and join us here today. We'll see what happens with the next election.
Yeah, I'm afraid we will.
Yeah. So thank you so much for having joined us today. And that is our segment on U.S. election fraud, possible election fraud in 2012. Thank you very much.